In 1964, I joined the Troubadours, and it must have been about the same time the Spectres were happening. And I think we played a couple of gigs together at a place called the Big Beat Centre in Anzac House in Perth. And that moved later out to Victoria Park in Albany Highway. And I remember the Spectres, but I'm not sure of the venues. I think it was the Big Beat Centre where we'd share the gigs, and along with other bands like Russ Kennedy and the Little Wheels, and I think Johnny Young and the Strangers, and the better Perth bands that love the rock and roll and are playing good rock and roll.
It was in this lively music scene that Bon first met Vincent Lovegrove, lead singer with rival band The Winstons.
I first met Bon in 1964-65, and he was in a band called The Spectres. He mostly played drums. The lead singer then was a guy called John Collins. And Bon used to get up and sing maybe 3 or 4 songs a night. We often as not found we were playing at the same venues. And he and I struck up a friendship. The scene in Perth, Australia at that particular time there was a lot of cabarets, and they had what they call corkage fees, where you brought your alcohol to a club, which were open till 3 a.m, and you paid for your corkage and they would store your alcohol. That's how they got around the licensing laws. There was also a lot of mining going up in the north of Australia at that stage, places like Mount Tom Price. And the miners used to work on and off. They'd work for 6 months and take 3 months off, and they'd accumulate a lot of cash, and they came down to Perth and would spend it in these clubs. The only problem was, and of course they had lots of entertainment there, the only problem was the bands that they wanted to have there were primarily what we called top 40 cabaret bands. In other words, what they did was their repertoire belonged to the top 40 charts and what you heard on radio. There was no originality then. So therefore there was a lot of places that opened up in the surf clubs along the west coast. One we played at a lot was at a place called Swanbourne, and they were called Stomps.
On leaving school, Bon became a postman, delivering mail by day and playing concerts by night.
I met Bon at Fremantle Post Office in late 1967. We were postmen together. Bon was, laughing all the time and, generally having a good time. But, with Bon, it was something like 2 lives. He'd come to work, but he'd virtually have his clothes on that he'd been working on at night, not have his uniform on. He'd just say where he'd been playing and where he was going to play and that type of thing. He actually said to us, why don't you come and see us some night when we're playing? So, we went to, I think it was Swanbourne Beach down there when he played at the Swanbourne Stomp down there. But we used to go, my mates and I used to go to different stomps around the area, and he happened to be in one of them. Swanbourne was the main one. He had a very good personality. He was a likeable chap and easy to get on with. So his personality, I'd say, was at the time better than his singing. But in the end, he was more known for his singing than his personality. But I think he had both, and that was one of his pluses.
In the end, it was Bon's friendship with Vince Lovegrove that proved to be the most fruitful for his career and turned him from a drummer into a frontman.
I suggested to him one time that he should, sing more rather than play drums, but it wasn't his band. The band was led by John Collins, and he was the man, he was the singer, and there wasn't any way that Bon was going to make it to be full-time singer of that band. And because both of the bands were in competition, it was a very competitive field at that time, I suggested to Bon that we join ranks and form one band and have 2 lead singers.
The Valentines were born and soon developed into the biggest gigging band in Perth.
My skin is green, but the trees are pink. For colours they don't mean.
In particular, the distinctive teaming of the 2 charismatic frontmen set the band apart from their contemporaries.
They're both pretty smooth back in those days when I come to think about it. But Vince was more laid back, obviously, than Bon because of the personality. And Vince had this aura of, you know, this star aura, whereas Bon had this mischief, this thing about him, this twinkle in his eye, this look on his face that would sort of bounce off Vince. Vince was the cooler one, you know, and it was most interesting to see that.
The main reason we did it was because probably both of us weren't really confident enough to lead a band on our own, and we worked off each other a lot. We had a pretty wild stage act for the time. You know, we should jump up on amps and have fire bombs going off on stage, and you know, all sorts of weird stuff. And we fired off each other. You know, we definitely gelled, and we'd work out stuff beforehand, what we would do and what we wouldn't do.
With the Spectres and the Valentines, which came along a little bit later, and the Valentines were a fusion of the Spectres and Vince Lovegrove's other band, I think they're called the Winstons, but they also came out of another thing that was kind of influential in Australia, which European people would recognise, was that whole instrumental rock tradition of like the Shadows. And so in Perth in the early 60s, you had what were called stomps. That was like dances that surfies went to, because there's a big surf scene, there's great beaches over there. And so there was a bit of that Shadows sound that was like surf music sort of coming in a bit. And the kids, these were just teenage boys taking on electric guitars because they saw Hank Marvin doing it. And the Beatles come along and they got long hair and they're singing. So the Australian groups, and particularly in Perth, be really isolated, really just making up the rules for yourself, because there were absolutely no parameters or no possibilities. It's just a whole new thing.
The Valentines entered the recording studio and began to release singles across Australia. This brought them to the attention of George Young and Harry Vander, who enlisted them to support the Easy Beats on tour in Perth. Yet, despite their success, they couldn't afford to give up the day jobs.
Bon used to be a postman, and I worked at a place called Palouse Menswear in Fremantle. He was a postie in Fremantle, so on his rounds he'd drop mail off to Palouse Menswear, where I worked, and we'd go out and have a drink, or we'd go around the corner and have a snort of speed or whatever, you know, and we'd go back to our respective jobs. And he, during the daytime, we saw each other. We'd have lunch together, or you know, whatever. He'd come as soon as he came around to Palouse. That was when I would knock off and take some time off, whether it was lunch or afternoon tea, morning tea. And we'd go and dream our dream of what we're going to do, what the next move was going to be, and what we're going to do next. And that's when we concocted the plan, well, you know, let's get out of here, let's go over to Melbourne.
The Perth music scene was getting too constraining for the Valentines, and they decided to enter a Battle of the Bands competition, with the first prize a trip to London.
It was a nationwide competition, so each state would have their own mini Battle of the Bands. And we won Perth's Battle of the Bands, and our prize was to go to Melbourne, not to London, but to go to Melbourne to compete in the National Battle of the Bands. Well, that was a big trip for us. We thought that was, you know, the best thing that ever happened. So we decided to use that as our gauge as to whether or not we would leave Perth. We went over, and of course we played in a big hall. There was 5,000 screaming fans. There was another 12 bands on, or 11 bands on. It was incredible. You only did 2 songs. You know, you could work out a great set with 2 songs, great stage act, great, you know, everything was great. We went on there. We didn't win, but what we did do during the 3 or 4 days we were there was go to every single club in Melbourne and see that it was a completely different world to where we came from in Perth. So we decided there and then, okay, this is it. Let's go. Let's come over here. So we went back home and worked towards going over, and it was about 6 months later that we left to go to Melbourne.
The move to Melbourne was timely. Not only was the city's music scene more advanced, it allowed the band to put their talent to the test as professional musicians.
They went to Melbourne from Perth, and Melbourne was the pop capital where you had Go Set magazine and sort of TV shows like Commotion, and all this stuff was happening there. And bands like the Valentines, even a third level ordinary band could be doing 3 gigs a night, because you do a suburban dance hall and a city nightclub and whatever. And so what that was the thing that still does make Australian bands great, is that ability to play, is just play on stage to people. And I think that was the training ground there. If you've got 3 gigs a night, you've got to get reasonably adept, you know.
when we hit Melbourne, we made a band decision. You know, it was a band rule that, and it was a very democratic band. But as anybody will tell you, any democratic band always has trouble, and isn't really democratic in the end. You know, the singers really run the show. And we made a pact in the band that we weren't going to do what everyone else was doing at that stage, which is, you know, 66, and that was take drugs and smoke pot. And I can remember Bon and I, when we went up to Sydney one time, and it was the first time either of us had ever had a joint, you know, late in the piece. It wasn't around when you were 15, 16 in those days. We were 20, 21. We went up to Sydney and, you know, we went and saw this band that we knew, and the keyboard player invited us back to his place to smoke some dope, you know, and it was the first time, and we were both nervous as shit. And we went back there and we smoked and got completely out of our head, and we were just shit scared in the corner of the room, giggling and wondering whether we should be there, and eventually we just slid our way out of